Are we starting right at 3 or are we gonna wait some more? What's the?
Let's give at least 5 more minutes. NDA is hopefully getting in touch with Dr. Moja, and so we'll see if he will still be joining us.
All right.
And then it gives us a chance to build our audience. Sorry, I forgot my camera wasn't on. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I just called. I didn't get him, but I left a message, sent a text, and then I just emailed him the link again.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'll just make sure I keep sending messages to the waiting room so folks know we're building our audience. Okay. Fred, Nikki, do y'all need co-hosts? Are y'all trying to screen share anything by chance during this discussion? Okay.
No, I'm not. Thank you.
Cool.
I'll be right back myself. So give me 1 minute.
Okay. Quick question for both of y'all. Do y'all mind if we record this? We didn't talk about that.
So I was actually hoping you would.
Okay.
I was like, I need to ask about, because the link and my website just launched, so we need the things.
Okay. Nikki, how you feeling about that?
All good. Sound good.
Okay. Wonderful. Because snow day, COVID, changing plans, that definitely changes the audience. And so I want to make sure everyone has access to the information that y'all are about to give.
Yes, yes.
NDA, if Dr. Moja isn't here, are you okay with us starting when Dr. Ferguson comes back? Okay. Oh, you're on mute, but I know you're saying something delightful.
I was like, yeah. I was like, with all that's happening in the world, you never know what's happening. So yeah, we just keep going forward, and then if someone jumps in, then great.
All right. Let me make sure he didn't just. Do not let me forget to press the record button before I start letting people into the room, okay?
I think it's actually already recording.
Oh, is it? Oh,
yeah.
Jamaica, did you do that? Oh, well, fantastic.
No, I did. I did.
Okay, wonderful. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and admit folks, Dr. Ferguson and Dr. Umoja joins us. Actually, let me go ahead and pin all of you. So that is front and center. Jamiko, Dr. Ferguson, and Nikki. All right, I got everyone. Okay. So I will go ahead and let everyone in.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So, hi everyone. My name is Jamiko McKenzie. I use he and pronouns, and I work as a residence life coordinator on campus. But for the context of this conversation, I am serving on the MLK Planning Committee. And will be a co-facilitator today for our Fireside Chat conversation. Dr. King once said, "We must use time creatively." And I thank you all for joining us here for this Fireside Chat, where we hope to do just that. In today's conversation, we will be elevating a variety of contemporary voices interested in not only elevating Martin Luther King Jr.'s work on structural change, but also they are interested in directly progressing the need of structural change through grassroots organizing, decolonizing education, storytelling, and a variety of forms of cultural work. Thank you again for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to our co-facilitator, Dr. Ferguson, who will introduce our panelists.
Oh, well, thank you, Jamiko. My name is Dr. Stephen Ferguson. I am in the Philosophy and Religious Studies program here at NC State, and also I have a joint appointment with Africana Studies. So it is a privilege to be here today. to introduce our panelists. As Jamiko has kind of framed everything, it's important to kind of see this fireside chat as a instance of an intergenerational relay race, in which in some ways our discussion is passing the baton to a new generation that wants to get involved in our liberation movement. And so in many ways, King becomes a kind of centerpiece for that, because King offers us a kind of interesting paradox. Every year that we celebrate Dr. King's legacy, we're often presented with a one-dimensional view of King. So he becomes the king of I Have a Dream. But oftentimes we don't talk about the king that opposed the Vietnam War, that organized the Poor People's Campaign, and also lost his life in the context of fighting for the dignity, the rights of sanitation workers in Memphis. And all of that forms a very important context, I think, that our three speakers will provide in terms of understanding King's legacy. And so without further ado, let me introduce them. So first we have Dr. Frederick Ingram, who is an assistant professor of instruction at the University of Texas, Arlington, in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice. And he also is a part of African American Studies at University of Texas, Arlington. His current research and teaching focuses are on the role that race and racism plays in the systems of higher education and criminal justice. Thank you, Dr. Ingram, for participating today.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Our second panelist is Nikki Franco. Nikki is a Caribbean abolitionist. Hold on, let me get the other, I'm reading off the paper. Is a Caribbean abolitionist, community organizer, and multidisciplinary cultural worker, a writer, podcaster, and facilitator of spaces for collective studies. She seeks to disrupt the bureaucratic frameworks of academia, and there are a lot of those here, and the transactional ways in which relationships exist under capitalism. Nikki's work experiments with truth-telling, radical history and thought, and revolutionary imagination. She is currently based in Miami, Florida, where she serves as the co-founder and political education director for FemPower MIA. She also works with the civic engagement. She's also the civic engagement organizer for Power U, the Power U Center for Social Change. From 2019 to 2021, she has served as the founding director for FemPower's Miami Community Bail Fund. So without further ado, let me introduce Nikki Franco.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ferguson, and for doing the mouthful with grace. I'm grateful.
And then lastly, our third panelist is Dr. Moja here yet? Or he hasn't?
He
Okay.
isn't. He's having technical difficulties, but we'll let you know as soon as he arrives.
All right, no problem. And our third panelist, who will join us shortly, is Dr. Akinyele Moja, who has been a longtime activist scholar in the Atlanta, Georgia area. But he's most prominently known as a professor of Africana Studies at Georgia State University and Atlanta University. And his research kind of grows out of some of the contemporary research on the Black Power movement, but he also focuses on the civil rights movement and other resistance movements of the 20th century. He is probably best known for his award-winning book, We Will Shoot Back: Armed Resistance in the Mississippi Freedom Movement, which was published in 2013 by New York University Press. And he's also known prominently as the co-founder with his wife of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, which is an organization committed to human rights, self-determination, and reparations for African descendants. Since 1989, they have participated and created the Malcolm X Festival, and one of the prominent kind of things that happens in Atlanta every year. But he's also been a significant member of the National Council of Black Studies and the Association of African American Life and History. So I guess give a round of applause for all of our panelists. All right, that's the internet applause has happened. All right, so let's begin. I thought that both Jamika and I, after talking yesterday, thought that we should begin, given that this is something that occurs during Martin Luther King's holiday, that one of the first questions we thought we should ask for our fireside chat is, what exactly do you see as King's legacy today? I guess I can open it up. Do you want me to pick someone to begin, or do you just want to start the conversation? Or should we go ladies first?
I was going to say, I'm fine with Nikki going first.
Thanks, y'all. So I think some of the things that come to mind, I mean, I think we can argue what the mainstream legacy is, and this de-radicalized, almost, I was saying earlier, like even like de-racialized version and sanitized version of Dr. King's legacy. And then I think for the sake of this space, it actually might be more powerful to reflect on what is the actual legacy, right? Like, as people interested in Black liberation, in grassroots organizing, and in studying our ancestors, like, what are the lessons for us to pick up from? I think some top of line things that come to mind for me is, Dr. King has this arc from sort of when he starts his activism work throughout all the way through his old book, his last book of Where Do We Go From Here, constantly talking about class struggle, right? And understanding the inextricable nature of race and class under a political economy of racial capitalism, right? I think now in 2022, we can be vigilant and be mindful as to why it's strategic for the elite and the mainstream corporate media and all the people that sort of feed us our messaging, for us to somehow not think of Dr. King, as someone who quite literally endorsed something even like a freedom budget with socialist Philip Randolph, right? That was very clear and very in line with what you would just describe as like democratic socialist programs, right? Universal or guaranteed annual income, housing, social security, these, and the fact that he was assassinated as he was preparing for the Poor People's Campaign march, for me, I think makes me think that we need to interrogate the sort of hidden class struggle that was so integral to his work for, for the 2 decades or so before he was murdered. So yeah, this conversation about class struggle, because I think that's been weaponized across racial lines, right? And as we see right now in the middle, in 2 years into a pandemic, we see hundreds, over 100,000 striking workers across the nation. I think we need to be more intentional and strategic around how we're thinking about class struggle and what we're up against, again, across racial lines, across gender and sexuality, and actually lean into solidarity. And it wouldn't be the first time we do so.
I actually agree with Nikki. I think that when we think about Dr. King, we have to think about him as a pro-poor, pro-marginalized, pro-oppressed individual. He always spoke for the least of us, not the most of us. His struggles, his fight for struggles, his fight for liberation, the words that he spoke, the words that he wrote were for and about the liberation of those who are the most marginalized and the most oppressed among us. When I think about his legacy, Dr. King was someone who was anti-militarism, anti-racism, anti-capitalism. And then we look at how the media, how, political pundits spin his legacy. We got MLK sales. We got folks that got MLK on flyers. We've all seen the memes with MLK with a do-rag on, MLK with waves. We've seen that. We've seen people literally make a mockery of a man who gave life against his will for the work of the oppressed and the liberation of those of us who are oppressed. So when I think about Dr. King, I think about him in a way that is the most deferential in a way that is the most humble, because I think that he did something that was transformative. I think that people tried to silence the radical that was in him and try to lean forward on Brother Malcolm being the only radical. Dr. King was absolutely radical as well. Dr. King absolutely had long, strong, staunch perspectives on whiteness and white supremacy and privilege and class specifically. And so I think that people like to paint pictures of him as this person who wanted to be in unity with white people and whiteness above everything else. And that is not at all who he was.
Right. Dr. Umoja, thank you for joining us. We wanted to start off with a question about how do you see Dr. King's legacy, in particular, what is his relevance today? If you wanted to add something to that, the initial conversation, I'm gonna open it up to you.
I appreciate it and apologize for being on late. I quote Huey Newton to say the spirit of the people is more powerful than the man's technology. But we go with that. But it's good to be here with you all today. At a fireside chat on a cold day, definitely could use a warmth. When we think about King's legacy, King talked to us about those triple evils, and I don't know if anyone addressed it already, of racism, militarism, and materialism, right? Excessive materialism. And we certainly are experiencing all of those things today. I mean, particularly when we think about what happened in the Senate the other day around voting rights. And we know that all this legislation going around today is to limit the amount of people who could vote, particularly our people. And so the same thing that Dr. King and others were fighting for in Selma still is apparent today. And it's something that we have to continue to work on and continue to push in terms of challenging voting rights. If it wasn't important, then people wouldn't be trying to stop us from achieving it. We can clearly see as well in terms of recent votes that denied the Build Back Better Act and things of that nature, resources that would go to folks after a pandemic. I mean, can you think about it? Dr. King, being a Christian minister, tried to live the best example, best legacy of Christ in terms of looking out for your neighbor. But certainly folks don't have that type of sensibility today. They're very cold-blooded in terms of their materialism. And as well as we continue to have a significant amount of resources, our tax dollars and things that go to the military budget. But even beyond that, I mean, I think one of the things that was made apparent after Ferguson was the militarization of police in this country and policing, which still is an apparent problem. So those things show a continuation of the legacy of Dr. King, the things that Dr. King fought about that we still need to be fighting about today. And when we look at current social movements, when we look at the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, still carry on that tradition. I even think of, years ago, we had Occupy Wall Street that challenged the materialism and the priorities. Even we even have to challenge the Biden administration. There were promises made, things like eliminating our student loans. And as old as I am, I'm still paying on student loan. You know what I mean? And so just how do we make things better for the least of these? That's what Dr. King was about. And so, there's still a continued need to push on that level. I heard my brother Ferguson, I believe, talking about how King has been sanitized, the radical has been taken out of King, who King really was, what his legacy, and we really think about that. I live here in Atlanta, and the radical King, the King that we know was pushing for reparations in reality, the King that was pushing for a more social democratic society. Those things aren't talked about. The fact that King said in his drum major sermon, which Coretta thought should be the sermon that reflected his legacy, that was used as his eulogy. He says that the United States was the greatest purveyor of violence on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, years later, people making those type of comments, they would have lost their tenure. You know what I mean? They would have been isolated. In fact, many of the things we articulate today, if King had argued those type of things, we would be vilified in society. Wow. So we really need to, and I'm glad we're having this conversation in this type of space with our students and on our campuses today, because if they don't know the real King, who will? Right. So I really applaud the organizers of this session today.
Well, thank you so much for that. Thank the three of you. So all of you have hit on, I think, a key point that we think about today. Clearly, there's an intensing class struggle going on in our country throughout the world. The increasing class divisions within African Americans has intensified. Why, when we look at public policy, when we look at political discussions and even barbershop discussions, why is the working class, the Black working class, not a part of those discussions? Why is a critique of capitalism not a part of our political discussion today, given the damage that is done, not just to the natural economy, that is climate change, but to our very existence? As good brother Umoja talked about, our student loan debts have not been forgiven. Reparations have not been paid. But we could talk about gentrification, which is a class phenomenon. We could talk about all these things, but constantly, not to belittle the significance of the Voting Rights Act, but in the last 50 years, we haven't articulated a public policy agenda that speaks to class struggle, particularly as it affects Black people. Why do you think that's the case? And I can open it up to the three of you.
So we have to be first honest, right? America was never built. It was never intended for anyone but white men to meet success, have success, and to have wealth. Mm-hmm. So any idea of perhaps creating any level playing field where the people who are enslaved in this nation have some level footing economically, politically, and everything else, as the white man would always be a fight and will always be a battle that they will wage war against, even the people who we elect to speak on our behalf, like white moderates. Look at Manchin, look at Sinema. They were elected as Democrats to be working on behalf of the working class people, right? To be working on behalf of those who are fighting for and seeking liberation. Even they are choosing to lean into their whiteness and their privilege. So this idea or this concept of like, why hasn't that been a thing? Because it doesn't meet their bottom line, and it directly violates status quo for there to ever be any level of equity legitimately in this country. So for us to be having conversations that don't directly assess the way white supremacy works, the way white supremacy looks, and the hold that it has on all of these systems, we are never going to be able to leave this space. Having a discussion about it just being a means of people needing to pull themselves up by their bootstraps or working harder, or partnerships between a Jay-Z and the NFL are being ways of liberating us. None of those things will ever actually work, because we are forgetting the quiet part, which is the white supremacy that controls all of it.
I would add too, when I was in college, I guess I was 18, I was introduced to a thinker by the name of MLK Cabral. He was the leader of the independence movement in a small country called Guinea-Bissau. And he was one of the greatest theoreticians of anti-colonialism, of national liberation, I think, that ever existed. One of the greatest revolutionary thinkers. And pointing to his own liberation struggle and pointing to other folks who were fighting for independence at that time, he said that the intellectuals, a lot of our leaders of our movements, including us right here, we're middle class, right? We're from the group, in Marxist term, they call it petty bourgeoisie. We ain't like the big bourgeoisie. We don't control the means of production, right? Our bosses are those people. But he said that those of us who engaged in the struggle, people like a Dr. King, right? People like most of the leaders we could think about, and entertainers and athletes we could think about, that they have to commit class suicide, he said. In other words, they have to not promote their own interests in the struggle to help, again, as we talked about, the least of these, right? To help the common everyday folk, to speak to their interests. And so, I'm reminded of when we have a struggle basically for representation, for Black folks to be represented in corporations, to be represented in elite jobs or whatever.
Thanks with Killer Mike.
But that doesn't necessarily help the brother and sister in the hood, right? It don't help. It doesn't necessarily help those folks. And so we have to think of solutions and programs that really help folks who are homeless. It helps the children who are in going to the K through 12 schools that the activists today call prison preps. It has to help those brothers and sisters that are incarcerated now. We need to think of a program that helps them. And, even when we talk about, I don't think the Democratic Party is set up to help those folks, right? If it did, Bernie Sanders would probably won the election, and the DNC probably wouldn't have, made sure that he wasn't going to win, and Biden won the Democratic Party nomination for president, because it was Bernie kind of put forth an agenda that represented more working and poor people. And going back to that, Biden made promises that would have been inclusive of that, but we see now. We don't even have to talk about Biden. Y'all be mad at me, I know, but Obama did the same thing, right? When we talked about healthcare, Obama chose whose program? It was the Republican program. It was just because of their white supremacy and their refusal to deal with anybody who wasn't them, that they didn't even go for it, even after Obama was willing to make a compromise. And so, I think most of our leaders and our politicians don't follow an agenda that's going to, help the majority of folks, particularly working and poor people in this country. And that's something I think that we have to get, those of us who are having these conversations, we need to have our own perspective and take our stands on that to really be more advocates for things that's going to aid, and not only aid, but arm and empower folks who are poor. And when I say arm, I'm not necessarily, I know I wrote the book, We Will Shoot Back, but I'm talking about arm ideologically to fight for our own interests.
Nikki, did you want to add?
Yeah, some of the things that come to mind is the fact that, when thinking of this question, trying to think back, like, when were we the best position to actually have a way to fight back the white supremacist fascist state? And we know that in the past 60, 65 years, the neoliberal agenda, which is bipartisan, right? That's why it's no surprise that Biden and Kamala are doing the thing that they're doing. This is business as usual, same thing with Obama, right? The neoliberal agenda in this country that has, that really came together kind of like in the past 65 years to solidify their strategy. Key points of that strategy was destabilizing unions and destabilizing grassroots organizations. And we have seen decades of where that's left us, right? So this conversation of class struggle and also the contradiction that comes up with people like us, like the distance between the folks that are intellectualizing in academia, getting the book deals, the panel deals, getting, interviewed by the New York Times, versus folks that are organizing, trying to build unions, canvassing neighbors. Like there is a disconnect that we need to be honest about. But I think, one of the things that comes up for me is just studying the strategy of the 1% in the past 65 years and what have been the most successful sort of anecdotes. And for me, I really believe it's strong grassroots organizations and strong unions. I think even this past year, some of the most exciting things I've observed from my POV is just seeing how many people are striking, right? Because that is the class nature of this country, right? There's the bourgeois, there's the ruling class, and then most of us are just workers, right? And there's some nuance in between, of course, not to like flatten it, but I think there's a conversation around what happens when people who might have an ideological commitment don't belong to organizations. What happens when people like us who have certain aspirations are not rooted even in our neighborhood or cities to strategies that can actually advance that. And I think we have a lot to learn from the global South. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel, right? We've seen some of the most militant mass movements in this time and for forever come out of all over the global South, right? And it's always done through grassroots mass movements, not to be redundant, but like, the charismatic leaders ain't gonna do it by themselves. It ain't happening. The politicians ain't gonna do it. The celebrity endorsements ain't doing it. So I think we need to look back a little bit to inform what we do moving forward.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to transition into our next question. How do we differentiate between speaking about change and actually being about change? In what ways do you encourage real structural change through the work that you're doing?
So I think a lot of people, it's easy for people to like posture and to essentially talk about what change should look like, but how are you actually being a disruptor? I fancy myself as a disruptor. When people are like, oh, you're an activist, I'm like, I like the word disruptor first, because when I think about the work that I do and how I position myself, I think about blowing up all of the way status quo positions itself, the way white supremacy positions itself. For me, I do it in the way that I teach, right? I do it in my classes. I'm a crim professor. And so when you think about crim, most of us look at it as a study like crime, criminality, and that sort of thing. But as someone who is a race scholar who grounds my research in critical race theory, I'm always thinking about how can I get my students to focus more on cause than effect? How can I get my students to focus more on who the people were prior to the committing of the crime versus the people who are incarcerated and the crime that they committed, and how we're looking at them as less than and all these other things. And so the push has been on, let's focus on the cause. That cause always leads back to survival. That survival is a class issue, right? That is rooted in white supremacy, that is rooted intrinsically in the experience that people have had that have led them into the need to be committing crimes, right? If we were pouring resources into our communities instead of into militarizing our police officers, right? If we were actually putting money into neighborhoods that would give our Black and Latino students better educational opportunities and better economic issues or instances for people to get better jobs, we would see a reduction in crime. But instead, we want to militarize our police. We want to pour more money into the military, and we want to drive both of those into the communities via the broken windows logic, right? So first, we have to understand, like, how do we teach people that being impoverished isn't a crime? The crime is the white supremacy that made us impoverished, that makes people have to react and respond based on their living condition. And if we're not focusing on that, we aren't getting anywhere.
Well, I guess I'll jump in here. I think first and foremost in my work today, I'm a scholar activist. And so in my scholarship, I try to raise issues that not only politically educate people, but also make people aware of struggles or things I feel are important to promote people's resistance. Like, for instance, just a brief example, right now, I know there's this case of Dr. Mutulu Shakur, who's a political prisoner that people are trying to get compassionate release on. So I'm working on his bio, and we're doing a journal and publications about his case that will make people more aware of it. In my teaching, though, the I not only try to do similar things in terms of content, but the work I've been engaging my students in I've kind of changed my methodology from them just doing papers or research and then we get rid of it at the end of the semester. You know, they throw it away or they use it for their professional development in the future. But we've actually been doing research projects for community-based grassroots organizations. So for instance, we've been doing work with a local community, Decatur, Georgia, around helping to develop a campaign around reparations, legislation on a municipal level, similar to what was done in Evanston, Illinois. And then with other groups here in the city of Atlanta, whether it's Southerners on New Ground, we did some research there that was utilized to get the no cash bond system here in Atlanta, other research that was being used in the city of Atlanta to decriminalize marijuana, which we know a lot of our people are incarcerated around. So I just in my own teaching and research doing that work and also working with grassroots organizations as community partners at you know, as a sister mentioned on the panel, we didn't, a lot of times in university, we let them choose who's acceptable and legitimate to partner with in the community. But I've chosen to work with groups that are more situated to deal with, you know, working and poor people in our community, fighting for those particular issues. So that's how I've tried to ground my work. I always feel like if you're a radical working in a university, I always think of that line from Higher Learning with Ice Cube, did you fight behind enemy lines? You really ain't supposed to be doing this shit, you know? But you know, hey, you know, I've been in here so long, they have to really come after me. By the time they got me, I would have been retired anyway if I don't just give up. So, you know, I think you know, we could have to fight in whatever means we have and whatever location that we're located. Everybody can't do the same thing, but you know, I'm blessed to be in a particular position to be able to do things with my students today and link them to folk in the community. One of the things I really feel blessed by is when I see students after the semester still working with organizations and joining organizations and being advocates for organizations. So I feel blessed that I've been able to do that as a guide for them.
Did anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I'll add some. Just coming back to thinking around the elite and their strategy, right? They use all mechanisms, right? They're not just moving policy. They're not just running think tanks. They're not just running media. Like, they're really influencing every single aspect of social life, of political life, economics. So I think similarly, should be up to a similar task. So I think for me personally, how that manifests is, you know, in my day-to-day as a community organizer with young people, high schoolers in a city like Miami that has the largest school policing department in the nation, actually trying to work through strategies of, you know, cutting funding there and putting it into other systems, which of course comes with a lot of challenges given the political landscape. I also think of the sort of leadership development, right? Because I always tell them, I'm like, y'all with us maybe a maximum of 4 years, right? Your high school career. But these are skills and sort of ideological development and leadership development, and also just like development as a human, which is something the system strips from us. That if you go on and go to college, you can continue to organize there. If you go on and get a job, you can go on and start a union there. So it's really just a seed and a stepping stone. I also think of the media and the cultural production, because I think the right like has this down packed, you know, in a way that, you know, we're really not even close, you know, and to the example earlier, right? Like, we are obsessed with seeing Black faces in high places, and we are obsessed with Black celebrities getting the best endorsements, right? Like, that does feel good. And that sort of makes me think like, okay, what is the alternative? What is the actual liberatory, independent culture that we are producing? So, you know, that's multifaceted, right? We got to tell ourselves all different types of stories, because, you know, I was saying this earlier, in the workshop. And if we got rid of prisons tomorrow and woke up, like that wouldn't actually, and it's something I want and want to fight towards, but that wouldn't fundamentally transform how we feel about ourselves, the dynamics within our friendships, our relationships, our families. And that's something we need to contend with. So to be concrete, you know, I even use a podcast and trying to be a bridge between more scholar voices and trying to bring that to kind of just more everyday people, right? Because I've seen that that's possible. We're told that the only people who can theorize are folks in academia, or even in just such a gross way, we're even told that it's like a white thing to do, right? That white people are the ones who theorize and they're the ones who do this. And again, all over the world and in our communities, we see that everyday folks, right, of working class background are actually absolutely able to theorize, and they're able to understand theory because we're living it every day in our lives. So I just try to be a bridge, with the podcast, just like cultural work, FemPower in Miami, doing the community bail fund work, and kind of learning different strategies and making mistakes all along the way in each of those arenas. But for me, I think even the transformation that has happened within myself of what I believe we're deserving of and what we're capable of, it doesn't just happen through like an organization. It doesn't just happen through a policy campaign. It doesn't just happen because I watched a show that made me feel good. So I'm hopeful that more and more people get aligned and that we can build solidarity and kind of deepen our strategy.
So let me ask a question before we move into the real question of how do we build a political movement that's self-sustaining? One of the big ideological fights that we have now is in the realm of popular culture. And part of that struggle is what I would label as the kind of embourbement of Black popular culture. So you have a weird kind of marriage of bourgeois values and ratchetness. How do you engage in an ideological cultural struggle? Because here's one of the dilemmas is, it's easy now for people to engage in cultural symbolism and not have any political substance. So Beyonce, Jay-Z, Killer Mike, and we can go down the list, have mastered what I call the James Brown theory of liberation. James Brown came to Black Power after it was over, but everybody remembers him as the music behind Black Power. In a similar kind of way, Beyonce's Lemonade, these other kind of culture forms, whatever is happening on social media, consume our political discussion, but they don't move us any further. So how do we engage in a kind of real ideological struggle when celebrity culture is being pushed down our throat as that's what has meaning for you in your life? So how do we engage as intellectuals and as activists in terms of pushing forward these political discussions beyond social media?
I mean, I think the way we look at and how we measure Blackness will never be or should never be from a myopic perspective, right? I think that the way that we all come to the journey, to the work, to how we end up in liberation is all different. All of the roads winding and ended up in the same place. But I think part of it is understanding first the accountability. Like one of the arguments that I constantly have with my cousin is about like, don't count people's pockets. That ideology. And I adamantly disagree. I'm like, the purpose of getting money is to then spread the wealth, right? Among your community, among your family, and do that sort of thing. So if we are all engaging in or rooting on or cheering on Black folks as they participate in Black capitalism, we are not really amounting to the change that we want to see. You can't tout Black liberation and we want to be free, but at the same time being like, yo, don't count Jay-Z pockets with the NFL deal. You got to wait and watch him work. You got to wait and see what he's going to do. You got to wait for this. You got to wait for that. Or watching celebrities who take videos of themselves rejecting giving kids money because they had to get it another kind of way. One of the things that I always say is that part of Black liberation is first understanding what our role in it is. We all have a role. Every single one of us has a role. Not everybody's meant to be a street soldier, a foot soldier. Not everybody's going to have the money. Some people are going to do the cooking of the food, right? Some people are going to write the work. Someone's going to tell the story. But each of us has a role in what that looks like. And part of it starts with first understanding that we are all fighting for liberation, not just for certain Black people, not just for cishet Black people, not just for cishet men, right? For all Black people. That means from the most of us down to the least of us. So first understanding what that even means, right?
Mm.
Before we could even get out here on front lines, be talking about like I'm advocating for Black people. Who? What Black people? The ones that are wealthy like you, who are at the Rock Nation or whatever brunch that y'all go to in your fancy clothes, right? That no one else who's impoverished is entitled to be at. Are you talking about those Black people? Are you talking about the Black people that you step over as you head to your event? Which Black people are we talking about? And so we got to be clear first in ourselves about who liberation is for. And if the work of your liberation is not for all of us, especially the least of us, you ain't doing it right.
But see, that raises an interesting question, kind of going back to King. In the 1960s, we could assume that the vast majority of African Americans were Black working class. And when we developed an agenda, when King and Malcolm X developed an agenda, they had to speak to that working class base. The Jay-Z's of the world, the Al Sharptons of the world, they can talk in imaginary terms about the Black community, but they don't define what Black liberation is for the Black working class today. And that's the problem that we have today, where we're basically in a kind of, what do you call the rascal wheel, where you're kind of going in circles. It took King 12 years to get the 1965 Voting Rights Act passed. The Voting Rights Act passed was basically chopped into pieces in 2013. Here we are in 2021, and we're still waiting on electoral politics, brokerage politics to get us legislation passed. But we're not having a serious discussion about what are the obstacles that we face in building a movement that's outside of electoral politics that's effective for working class people. And that, for me, that seems like a real obstacle that we face, not just on the ground, but also ideologically, because we have a lot of people talking about emptiness, about Blackness this and Blackness that. Killer Mike is the best example of this. And people get enamored by, well, if we open up a Black bank, we're going to be rich. That doesn't get us in the point of charting a direction forward in the ways in which King talks about community or chaos, labor has dignity. Those are the kind of things that need to be at the forefront of our discussion. Even if we're in the barbershop having a discussion or the beauty salon, those are the kind of conversations rather than, man, I really like lemonade, or I think Ice Cube is doing good stuff for us, but we can't have a conversation about how Ice Cube from early on was a Black conservative. It was just Black conservative and Farrakhan verse. And it hasn't changed in that sense. So I'm saying, where's that generating discussion to push back against a kind of this empty cultural symbolism that really gets at some hardcore issues. I mean, think about it, even as Dr. Umoja talked about homelessness. Where is the movement in Atlanta that fights all of the stuff that the Black administrators and elected officials are doing against homeless people in downtown Atlanta? So those are the kind of issues that I'm thinking of, where we push the movement forward by kind of breaking out of these old modes of doing things, but still learning the lessons from the past, I think is the way I'm trying to frame it.
Yeah, I think we have to learn the lessons from the past, but even apply some new analysis, because the political situation is different too than what King and Malcolm face. In fact, for what they are even articulated at that time, it might need something a little bit more nuanced and direct than what King and Malcolm had to, they're living, at a time too that segregation was still a reality. And remember, segregation kind of united all of us around that. And so even it had created some limitations for the Black bourgeoisie, if you will. It's you feel what I'm saying? And so and they still face some things that most of the Black community faces, but it's but then they have access to things that, you know, my parents and grandparents couldn't have imagined, you know, that they would have access to today, right? And so, and, you know, I even think of the first time I came, or after I moved to Atlanta, my father-in-law came down here and he said, man, I couldn't imagine I would see Black people behind counters. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Some of the reality has significantly changed. But back to the original question, if I may, in terms of how do we deal with this content today as we address popular culture? One is, I think we have to promote and push when we do have radical and revolutionary representations. And when I say push, I'm talking about in the spheres of people we organize. And so part of it, it means that we got to have connection with folk ourselves to be able to have those conversations with folks. But I think even with the more popular expressions by folks who might not be as revolutionaries, can we take some of that content and have deeper and broader conversations with folks to critique? One of the best examples I saw that is one of the best educational experiences I had in terms of me being educate folks, but me being educated myself is between 1998 and 2006, I was able to go into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, and one of the political prisoners there was the brother I mentioned before, Mutulu Shakur. And he would encourage conversations around hip hop. In fact, he told me, and that was one of the things I learned, if I wanted to be more effective at talking to the young brothers in the penitentiary, was to talk to them about hip hop. And I remember some of my students came in with me to engage in a conversation, and he question of Nas came up, and he was telling my students that Nas is not going to give a certain type of analysis. That's their job as somebody who possesses a certain type of political sophistication, and to be able to come in, not only in prison, but on the street and be able to articulate certain things. But if we don't have a connection with folks to have those conversations, like I think you mentioned being in the barbershop, if we ain't there, and the fact that the barbershop we going to is someplace we're not going to engage certain folks. Right. So I think it's important for us to be in certain spaces, to have certain conversations, and to use everything. Right. You know, to use sports, you know, I mean, use movies, and to be able to see the same things that folks are seeing and watching, to be able to make these analyses. I think it makes us more effective, and for them to be able to critique it afterwards.
Nikki, did you want to add?
Sure. I'm thinking of James Boggs, who talks about this in Manifesto for a Black Revolutionary Party. And he sort of talks about how the elite have always known that they'll need to have some slivers of the Black class be able to enter the club, right? It's extremely important to sort of affirm, right? So it's not surprising that, you know, that was written like 65 or sometime in the 60s, that here we are. And I love Lemonade, I love Beyonce, I love Jay-Z, like and I think that's fine, but our role is to heighten the contradictions. More and more people need to understand what Cedric Robinson talks about in Black Marxism. Like, capitalism has a racial characteristic about it, period, which is the same about our government, right? It's the same of our institutions, right? That's why some people say like, decolonizing museum, decolonizing academia, decolonizing our government. For some people, it's raising a question mark, because all of these institutions have an inherent characteristic of it that is racist, that is white supremacist. So, you know, some of the things I'm thinking is like how this point of conversations, like dialogue and relationships that sort of tether us to people, is like where that trust happens, right? Because if you pull up on someone and you're talking about like, you know, all these capital, like if you're trash talking people who we look up to, or who sort of affirm the the sort of upwardly mobile ladder that so many of us aspire to, you know, it's not necessarily always gonna hit, but I do think we need to heighten the contradictions, right? And we could take it case by case. Like, what is the problem with Jay-Z taking a check from NFL? Well, what does the NFL do as an institution? What do they fund? Like, we can break it down. It doesn't have to be the super complicated thing. But right now, I think, you know, Black capitalism is winning that cultural war, right? Like it seems sexier, it seems more, it's more intoxicating. And it's the same thing with Obama. Again, our government has a characteristic to it that it doesn't matter who's on there. And, you know, I think we can even say, as someone who was supporting Bernie's campaign, like, we would have had to brace ourselves for Bernie Sanders to disappoint us time and time again, right? Like, I don't know that Bernie Sanders on there would have been able to make major cuts to that Pentagon budget, real talk, right? Like, that is the MO of this country. There is a certain MO of capitalism. So I really think we need to deepen folks' understanding and break it down, like, make it simple. We don't have to make it so complicated. And slowly, and I'm sure that's how it works for us, like, as you start developing your ideological framework, like, you see it everywhere, right? It's really hard to unsee. So I think how we're able to popularize those conversations and those analyses is really important. And of course, it happens through relationships. Like, we could have these conversations within our community. But yeah, they're definitely winning. Like, they have right now the culture on a chokehold. Like, if you're, you know, watching the Shade Room every day, it's very clear what the culture is on.
Right.
That's a separate conversation.
Right. Jamiko, did you want to jump in? I had a question, but I'll let you if you want to. Okay. So let's ask a question, because we've been beating around the bush on this question. One could arguably make the case that the Black Lives Matter movement as a social movement has kind of slowly come to an end. So one of the questions we could ask is, how do we build a self-sustaining Black social movement that has working class interests at the core of it? How do we begin to lay the foundation for that? I mean, in many ways, my view of the struggle is as an intergenerational relay race. And each generation needs to be able to hand the baton to the next generation to continue the struggle. And I think that serves a multiplicity of functions. One, it allows for a grounding for us to have real conversations, but it also influences people's social consciousness about what is politically possible. And I think we're in a moment now where capitalism seems like this is the only game in town. So just a generalized question, what do you think is necessary for us to build a social movement again that learns from the mistakes of past social movements like the Civil Rights Movement, Black Power movement, the Pan-African movement? How do we begin to build that?
I think first I have to say I disagree with BLM being dead or close to it. I think BLM is very much alive. I think the difference between a social movement like Black Lives Matter, civil rights, and that sort of thing is that Black Lives Matter chaptered itself out, right? So you have, like, you know, like DC BLM, you got Dallas BLM, you got Atlanta BLM. And I actually don't have a problem with that, because I feel like it keeps them from, like, picking off our people, like our one person, and remove that person from being able to do the work. But I do think that we need to make sure that all of our value systems and what we're fighting for are aligned. I think part of it, to your point, is that a lot of us get co-opted by capitalism, right? One of the phrases that I literally cannot stand is that it's a start phrase. That sends me spiraling, because people love the fact that we got Black Lives Matter way, we got a mural, right? We got the changing of a name on a building, and all of those things are performative measures. And we have to stop being so easily impressed by the fact that white people lean into interest convergence because there's some benefit to them, right? They have us believing that some measure of something is very shiny object syndrome, right? Where give them something to distract them from the work. And we have to get focused. Like, our ancestors were hungry, figuratively and literally. We have become so complacent because we've enjoyed some measures of of a liberal existence that a lot of us have lost sight of, like what real struggle is, right? Because the white man is not physically kicking in most of our doors and coming in and stealing our children and stealing our women and beating our men down, because that's not happening. A lot of people have lost sight of the fact that we are literally still fighting. We have been fighting. We have only had some measure of freedom for like the last 60 years. And for the last 6 years, we've been trying to get a right to vote that we are still fighting for in 2022. So we don't have time to be distracted by shiny things, right? Enjoy joy, enjoy life, enjoy luxury in whatever shape that comes to for you. But please be clear, right? That even though, like Nikki said, the few of us that touch 1 million or the few of us that touch 1 billion, there are so many more of us that will never touch 1,000.
Yeah.
Let me clarify for a second. One of the points I was making about the Black Lives Matter movement is similar to the Black Power movement. Richard Nixon comes in and defines Black Power as Black capitalism, but it also signals the kind of decline of the Black Power movement. In a similar way with Black Lives Matter, corporations, even the leadership of the Black Lives Matter movement has been incorporated into corporate capitalism. And so while there's tons of stuff happening at a grassroots level across the country, in all intents purposes, the movement as we know it has been co-opted, I guess is the best way to put it. And so that's what I was referring to. Not that, there's not stuff going on still in the name of Black Lives Matter, but seems like we need to move to a different stage now.
I agree. We need to move to a different stage. I'm not quick to write a eulogy for it yet. And I do agree that there have been elements co-opted, and we can't forget political repression, the repression on the membership. But I do agree that whether it's a new movement or the extension of what we already have, that it's a need to take the resistance to a new level, a more sophisticated level. I think that a lot of us, what we saw in 2020 was a lot of mobilization. We saw a lot of people in the streets, and that's one aspect of it. And maybe at a certain point, if people are taken to the stage of being ungovernable, then that's a whole nother level. But that the type of mobilization we saw is not sustainable, really. So we would expect it that at a certain point that would have declined after a certain period of time. But I think, and I keep on reminding people, even in before 2020, is we have to look to people like Ella Baker. You know what I mean? And Ella Baker talked about organizing people in communities. So organizing people is not necessarily having marches and demonstrations for days, but it's, helping people to establish those grassroots organizations and resistance networks to challenge around issues that confront people around things like gentrification, around things like miseducation in our schools, around just questions of empowerment and fighting for empowerment in local communities. And that day-to-day work that's not as exciting, you know what I mean? It's not as sexy, but to do the political education of organizing and building institutions that can be sustainable and challenging. And so that's the type of work that I think we have to engage in, that happens over years, don't happen, over a few months. And it's not as media driven as some things, but certainly there's been attempts to divide people. And so I think there has to be some intergenerational networking, I would say, because previous generations of activists have probably seen some of these things before, and could help us navigate trying to get caught in the same traps of, again, repression as well as co-optation that you referenced earlier. And I think it's not only happened in Black Lives Matter, but even in the reparations movement. There's been some co-optation. And so we have to be careful about these things as we move forward, and to do the type of political education internally in our movements, which also helps to sustain us from one generation to the next.
And I think one of the important points both of you guys have mentioned so far in different ways is like the role that leadership plays in keeping a movement going. Leadership doesn't have to be one person.
No,
it can be many people, but you need that. And for me, that's one of the limitations of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that by decentralizing the organization, you can't build that sustainability, that continuity, because there's going to be ideological debates that you need to have settled. There's going to be opportunists that come into the movement. You need that leadership to be able to chart the ship, even as you go through all these conflicts and struggles. So that's where I think both of you are right on the money. Nikki, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would say some of the limitations that we are observing with the movement for Black Lives and the organizations that are housed under that movement, Power Youth organization I organize with included, is that the movement is housed within the nonprofit industrial complex, and that's going to impact like all of us, every single organization that, is like in the movement for Black Lives group. We get our funding from groups like the Ford Foundation, from Warren Buffett Foundations, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, I'm blanking on her name, she's been doing big donation rounds to literally this list of organizations. Absolutely a problem, right? And again, like, not to hamper back on like the 1% agenda, but like that's where we're at, right? Like, we're 65 years into like full-blown neoliberalism. It's not surprising that the quote unquote US left is housed and funded by our enemies, right? That's a contradiction that, that's a bigger debate. But, even us with our high schoolers, we had a debate around whether they should pay membership dues, right? Something simple. And we broke this down. We broke down our budget transparency so they could see where money's coming from. And then we compared that to, again, organizations outside of the US. And we brought in some, like what Thomas Sankara, revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso, talks about, like, who funds you runs you. And of course, they have an amicable face to it, so when 2020 came, they were like, yes, do whatever you want. But it would be a lie. Anyone who works for any of these organizations, like, we know very well, we have to meet with funders, make reports for them, shape campaigns that sort of appease to what they want. Right. It's no surprise that we're just hitting limitations on limitations on limitations. Right. And then of course there's all these other things of like political repression, organizations collapsing because of conflict. Like, we do not lack the skill, or we do not have the skills to actually like contend with one another and struggle with one another in right relationship. Like, there's so many things contributing to it. But I think the nonprofit industrial complex is going to continue to complicate this, because we're also seeing this with like our celebrity activists, right? People who are getting multi-million-dollar deals. And, there's a big question mark there around like, with all of this visibility, have the material conditions of Black folks in this country actually improved? Right. There's a lot of things we can look to that would say no. Right. So that's definitely a consideration. How we get out of there, then that's a whole other debate.
No, that's a brilliant point. Absolutely brilliant point. Brilliant. Did you want to jump in, Jamiko? Okay.
Yes. So throughout this week for our MLK commemoration, we've been talking about the idea of solidarity. What does solidarity mean to you all? And how can we create deeper connections within and across difference?
I think solidarity for me looks like one of the conversations that we often have is that just because something doesn't directly benefit you or doesn't directly affect you doesn't mean that you should not have compassion and empathy for the people who are being affected, right? Like we're talking about like Black trans lives mattering, and then cishet Black folks being like, well, I don't really understand it anyway, so I don't really care, right? Like they're still Black people and their lives still matter. So being able to tap into the empathy, right? And being able to understand that just because I may not fully understand the complexity of a situation doesn't mean that I don't or I shouldn't be able to throw compassion their way or be there to be able to be in consideration for or a co-conspirator for, right? So understanding that role, that's part of disrupting the white supremacy, right? That makes us believe that there's some hierarchical structure to Blackness, right? And us disrupting what that looks like so that way every last one of us can be a part of that liberatory movement is how we get to solidarity, in my opinion.
I just think, it's a matter of political education. Again, like I remember this old saying, I think it comes from Mao Zedong, that you got to unite the many to defeat the few. And so when we think of people who are oppressed, and I'm talking about around the world, then we got to look to where our friends and allies are, where we can get support. And, and just thinking about what Nikki just said, it ain't the nonprofit, right? Complex, right? It ain't them, but it's, thinking of folks around this globe. When we think about, if we link ourselves to them, we're in the majority and we have allies and friends all over the damn place, and so I think we gotta prepare our consciousness in that type of way. The folks, I think of like a Queen Mother Moore, Malcolm X, Robert Williams, Mabel Williams. They all had this global consciousness in terms of who their friends were. Even looking at Sister Asada and to be located in Cuba to get asylum or to be in exile there. And she eloquently talks about that in her autobiography, that if you're fighting for liberation, you're fighting for freedom, then you got to be international in your scope. And so, and that applies, Brother Frederick put it in the context of cis and trans, and that's true too. Looking even within our community as to who are friends and who are our enemies, we have to begin to look at who's oppressed and how can we support each other, how can we have each other's backs, and how can I be down for somebody even if I ain't a part of that segment of our people. And so we have to really look at things in those terms. It's just a question of do we really want to be free or not? And then in order to be free, who do I gotta align myself with? Who do I have to have their back, and who do I expect to have mine?
Yeah, I'm thinking of course, like Fred Hampton and the Rainbow Coalition, right? Like that always, that just like that symbol just always hits it on the nose. And definitely want to affirm this internationalist commitment that as people in the empire, we gotta have, right? This conversation of Cuba and all of the, countries that are experimenting with alternatives to capitalism and the attack that this country that we pay taxes to and that is making decisions on our behalf is acting. So I would just affirm what y'all offered. And I also, I think even with this point that you made, Dr. Engram, around cis and trans, right? And just differences, right? Like it could be white and black or non-black, and the list goes on. I think we need to get very vulnerable and do the almost like spiritual and soul work to get real around the fact that it's the same system of heteropatriarchy that is a colonial byproduct is also harming men, right? Cis hetero men, it's stripping them from their humanity, from their ability to feel human and to feel and to connect, right? And that is the same system that is killing our Black trans sisters on the street, right? So I think we need to make those connections for people, for our folks, in just conversation and storytelling. I had a very moving exercise in Highlander out in Tennessee, which is the sort of community center where, you know, Dr. King was training at, Rosa Parks was training at, you know, a lot of these folks were coming out of. And it was the first time that I was hearing white Southerners vulnerably talk about, you know, all the ways in which things like this, you know, like the big pharma interest and how that's impacted their families and the death and all of this. It was the first time I had really heard that in a vulnerable and what felt like a safe place. And I think that was an eye-opening, you know, because at that point, it was like, oh, these are the same people at the end of the day, and they don't even care to go against their own, because it's really the elite, the few, against everybody else, right? So there's also white working class people all over this country that are also getting screwed over every single day. And I think if we believe that we're capable of building mass movements, there's no way that we'll build movements of millions of people and not have conflict, not have difference, right? For example, I can't imagine being in a union of, you know, I don't know how many workers, where we're in the same conditions, right? Like we're going through the same things in this context. And I'm sure that there will be probably some men there that are misogynist and that I would not agree with. And there will probably be some white people there that are anti-Black and racist. And somehow we, you know, and I think that is what's powerful about unions, and we've been seeing it these past months, like you gotta bind together, deepen that trust for like a greater good and a greater purpose. So I'm curious to see what that could look like, that impact just multiplying all across the country. Yeah, that's what we'll say for now.
Yeah, that's perfect. So just kind of, we have about 14 minutes. I don't know if we're going to run over or not, but to kind of close it out, I think one of the cornerstones to King's political philosophy is a notion of human dignity. And even as we get to the latter part of the King after 1965, particularly when we get to the sanitation workers and their slogan, I am a man, part of what grounded King's sense of class solidarity in terms of the Poor People's Campaign was just a genuine sense of human dignity that all people should share. And all of you just kind of recently spoke to that in terms of issues around queerness and a range of other issues. How do we bring that back to our sense of community? That part of being Black, part of being a human being is having human dignity. And let me just elaborate on that a little bit more. Part of that also entails in not engaging in things that degrade people, even if it means for a momentary escape that you watch reality TV. Those acts degrade people, and it doesn't build a sense of human dignity, and therefore we can build a larger political solidarity. So how do we get back to that kind of Kingian principle, if you will, of human dignity as a cornerstone of politics?
First, I think we got to do the work within our own circles, right? One of the things that my friends will tell you is like, you're not allowed to say the B word around me when you're referring to women. You're not allowed to call them females around me when you're referring to women. Call the women or call them by their names. My mother always says to me, like, do you have to disrupt everything? And I'm like, yes, I do, because everything is a problem. I was like, it's like being a cardiologist and someone goes into cardiac arrest, and because you're not on the clock, you're not supposed to do anything. I'm like, I can't help if you jump wrong, right? You start spewing patriarchal concepts, you start spewing white supremacist ideologies and anti-Blackness, I can't let that ride. And so I think part of it is first self-checking our own communities and our own circles, because from there you can then begin to branch out, because for everybody who I enlighten, they can enlighten someone else. I think about two of my students who I taught school to prison pipeline this past fall, course I created, and two of the young women in that class, one of them started the semester a little, are we gonna learn anything in here? Yeah. That was her energy, right? This class ain't hard enough. And then by midpoint of the semester, her and another sister decided, like, we want to put on a school to prison pipeline panel in collaboration with the NAACP. We want to bring in, local Dallas school board members. We want to bring in a police officer. And now they're actually physically doing the work. This morning, they sent over, they're presenting at a leadership conference this weekend. about anti-Blackness.
Mhm.
Prior to taking my class, they couldn't even just define what anti-Blackness was. So for me, that's what it looks like, right? It's starting in the most minimal, the most minute spaces and corners, and you don't even know who you're affecting when you're having these conversations about disruption and about disrupting status quo. And now they are going out and they are doing the teaching. So
Absolutely.
Well, I really think that it begins sort of like what Frederick said. We got to have conversations ourselves and maybe develop what we see as dignity. I think it's the challenge is going to be, or one of the challenges, I shouldn't say the challenge, one of the challenges is going to be is how do we develop a framework for dignity that's not respectability politics.
Yeah.
And so how do we make a new sense of dignity? And to borrow from what Nikki said earlier, how do we include in the conversation one that, you know, deals with mutual respect for our differences, because we ain't a homogeneous folk, right?
Right.
We're diverse, but how do we, you know, develop a mutual respect? How do we carry on a sense of commonality,
Right.
of spirit and soul, as Nikki talked about? But how do we create something that's visions liberation?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So it's a couple of elements and components that has to come up in there. We still got it. We ain't lost it 100%. You know, I think, and like I tell younger folk all the time, I'm proud of some of what I see from young people. You know, so we have not totally lost it, and I think people have contributed some new standards and examples of what dignity looks like for us. And so I think it ain't gone. There's some things that we can learn from recent generations and we could build upon to make something even bigger. But I think one of the things is just to imagine something different. I think, to me, one of the biggest challenges I think we're having is just imagining something different from what they prescribe to us is freedom and liberation, or what how we're supposed to live and what our possibilities are. So I think, you know, so I think it really starts from what Frederick talked about, though. We need to have these conversations ourselves and to build something new and to live something new. It's really about living it, you know, talking about it, but also living it too.
Yeah, I love that we're sort of affirming the leadership of young people in this moment, because I feel like for me personally, like being close up to that day to day is like really what keeps me going. And yeah, just want to affirm that we should all be investing in young people's leadership and in their creativity as like they're tasked with building this world. You know, I'm thinking of a bell hooks quote where she talks about how in a culture of domination, we have a very hard time thinking about power except just externally, like the power over. And it's really hard to think about power within us. And, you know, hearing y'all speak, it really makes me think, I mean, I think we have such a challenge with seeing dignity in other people because a lot of us don't see dignity within ourselves, right? We live in an incredibly alienating, humiliating society that makes us feel worthless every day, right? Like that is the message we're getting every single day. So, you know, I agree. There's a lot of internal work and work in our close relationships that has to happen, because I don't believe we'll be able to somehow see, you know, dignity with our comrades in Cuba, or dignity with people that look like our oppressors historically, if we can't even see dignity for ourselves. So I think we're up to a lot of also spiritual tasks, right? Like the ones that we don't talk about enough in our movement, and just like healing, transformative, shedding work.
Well, thank you, all of you, for this enlightening discussion. I mean, I think in so many ways, it's every year I kind of engage in a kind of revisiting of King, whether it's by way of documentary or speeches. But what always strikes me as King in a limited way, but keep in mind here, Ella Baker's critiques of him and Snick's critique of him is that there was always a sense of discussion that went on for King about what direction the movement should go in. And I honestly think that we fulfilled the task of a fireside chat in terms of the range of topics that we've discussed today. So with that said, I will let Jamiko close us out. And as they say in pop culture, peace, hair grease, and stay safe from COVID, baby.
Awesome. Thank you to all of our three panelists. I appreciate the various different perspectives that all of you brought to the conversation. I think really what I got from this conversation is that like leadership looks many different ways, and we all have the power within us to create change within our communities and across all communities. It's important for us to think about like where our funding is coming from, how do we interact with others, and really being clear about what our goals and our objectives are. I got from this conversation that the legacy of MLK is multifaceted, and it's continuous, and it's definitely something that can help us move forward. I think about the principle of Sankofa whenever I'm doing any work, being focused on looking back to go forward. And as we end this conversation, I think we're at a great space. I think we definitely achieved the goal of today, thinking about using time creatively. And I really appreciate all of that. All of you have shared today. And I also appreciate our audience for being here and really listening to this conversation. I hope that folks take what they learn in this space forward into their communities and with their families and friends. So again, thank you all for being here today. Be on the lookout for a assessment that will come to everyone's emails. And awesome, have a great evening.
Hi all, thank you.
I guess we should ask, do you guys have questions of us? Something we didn't ask.
Oh no, it was good. Y'all were pretty thorough. They were pretty thorough. That was